What would you do if you knew your army was doomed before the battle even began? This is the question that has echoed through the centuries, crossed empires, shattered certainties, and become one of the most unbelievable true stories of all time. The story of a commander who didn't need swords, spears, or walls to win. He only needed something few warriors master: pure deception. Yes, it really happened. And it wasn't a simple trick, it wasn't a stroke of luck, it wasn't a historical coincidence. It was a calculated, meticulous strategy built with the coldness of someone who understood that in certain wars the mind is more deadly than any blade. You are about to find out. The general who won an entire war by deceiving every enemy who dared to march against him, a feat so astonishing that many believed it to be a legend, an event so absurd that historians still debate how it was possible. In the heart of a world where empires rose and fell, where battles shaped the destiny of nations, arose a commander who defied all the rules of war. He did not possess the largest army. He did not have the best weapons. He had no powerful allies, no safe routes, no impregnable walls. On the contrary, he was surrounded, pressured, watched by forces that surpassed him in number, gold, and power. His people expected the worst. His advisors predicted ruin. His enemies, confident, already celebrated a certain victory. But what no one imagined was that this man was carrying an invisible weapon, a weapon that didn't appear on maps, didn't march across the fields, and didn't shine in the sun. The weapon that would transform the impossible into reality, the illusion. And this is where the story becomes truly unbelievable. Because while his enemies raised colossal armies, he raised doubts. While they built war machines, he built fears. While they marched with confidence, he marched with lies so well crafted that they seemed real, even to those who invented them. Ultimately, what is more deadly, a sword, or the certainty that you are surrounded by thousands that don't exist, a shield, or the terror of believing that your every move has already been anticipated, a fortress, or the conviction that your enemy knows something you don't? That's the essence of this story. A war won by the mind, not by weapons. A battle where the strategy was so advanced it seemed modern, so daring it seemed like fiction, so ingenious it became legend. A real event, documented, studied, remembered, but which still seems impossible today. And what's most impressive, this general not only defeated a larger army, he defeated all the armies that believed they knew him. Every step, every rumor, every smoke signal, every false trail, every sound in the darkness was part of a plan so absurd that even his own soldiers hesitated to believe it. But the truth is, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that to win that war he didn't need to fight, only to make the enemy fight against itself. Now get ready, because from this point on, you'll feel firsthand the escalating tension, the weight of the strategy, the escalating deception, and the moment when everything changes. This isn't just a true story. It's a masterpiece of human intelligence, an event so epic that it defies logic, and it all begins when the enemy makes the first mistake, a mistake he should never have made, and one that the general had been expecting from the start. And it is precisely at that moment, when the enemy makes the first decision, guided by fear, that the true machinery of deception begins to turn. Each of their steps strengthens the general's plan. Each doubt fuels the chaos. Each planted rumor transforms into a storm. And you, who are following this true story as unbelievable as any fiction, need to stay with me until the end to understand how a strategic mind can turn an entire empire upside down. Because what is about to happen is not just a military trick. It's a spectacle of human intelligence that defies everything we thought we knew about war, tactics, and survival. But before we move on to the point where war truly changes form, where illusion becomes weapon and fear becomes army, I need to ask you something simple, yet essential. If this story is captivating you, if this real event awakens in you the same curiosity that has driven kings, generals, and historians throughout the centuries, then leave your comment below. Tell me what you think of this impossible strategy. Say if you've ever heard of this war. Say which side you would be on if you were thrown into the middle of this absurd conflict. Your opinion helps keep this flame burning and makes this community grow into a true army of history enthusiasts. And warrior who is listening to me, if you want to understand what really happened, if you want to follow every detail of this insane strategy, every twist and turn of this true story that seems like fiction, then leave your like now. This shows that you are ready to march with me to the end. The like seems small, but it's what tells our algorithm oracle that this content matters, that these epic stories deserve to be delivered to more people, that the truth behind these impossible events cannot be forgotten. And what's more, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time, because here we reveal hidden real facts, absurd strategies, improbable wars, and stories so surprising they defy human logic. Here, each video is a new campaign. Each narrative is a battle won against oblivion. Subscribe and become part of this army that honors the most unbelievable true stories that have ever happened. Now get ready, for what comes next is the moment when the general takes his boldest step, one that no commander before him had dared to take, and which would forever change the course of this war. At that time, the kingdom seemed to be breathing its last. Its walls were worn, its villages silent, its trade routes empty, and each dawn brought only the same omen, the inevitable approach of an enemy 3 times larger, richer, better armed, and driven by an insatiable desire for conquest. The wind carried rumors of burned cities, crushed legions, and rival generals who swore to erase that people from history. And yet, in the center of this devastated landscape, there was a single man who refused to succumb to despair, a general with a firm gaze, whose reputation came not only from the battles he won, but from those he managed to avoid. His name, feared by some, respected by others, was remembered as the commander who saw beyond the maps, beyond the walls, and beyond the apparent inevitable fate. He knew that facing that colossal force in open field would be the same as delivering his people to the abyss. The threat advanced with heavy steps, as if each enemy soldier were part of a gigantic machine created to crush any resistance. It wasn't just an army, it was a storm of iron and fire that devastated everything in its path. And while other nations sought refuge or desperate alliances, the general remained silent, observing, calculating, studying every move of the adversary. To an outsider, it seemed like madness. How could a commander with so few men, so few resources, and so little hope stop something so devastating? His captains, though loyal, murmured amongst themselves that perhaps it was time to negotiate surrender. Terrified people prayed to forgotten gods, but the general didn't believe in surrender. He believed in strategy, he believed in intelligence, he believed in the invisible power of doubt, and it was this silent certainty that began to change the course of the war even before the first sword was. He understood, like few others, that in history battles are not won only by swords, they are won by decisions. And no decision would be more courageous, more absurd, and more unexpected than the one he was about to make. For while the enemy depended on brute force, he would rely on something that could not be weighed: illusion. Yes, this true story is built on deception, invisible strategy, psychological tactics so advanced that even today they seem too modern to have happened back then. But they did happen, and they really did. The kingdom was so outnumbered that even the ground seemed to fight against them. The enemy possessed 3 times as many soldiers, twice the supplies, better armor, siege beasts, heavy cavalry, experienced archers, and generals who had never lost a battle. They marched with the absolute confidence of those who believe that destiny has already been decided. But the general knew that destiny can be bent, and that sometimes it is possible to win an entire war without fighting, simply by making the enemy believe in what does not exist. That was the key. Not the sword, not the shield, the lie. And it was in this desperate scenario, with the weight of an enemy empire closing in and the echo of fear spreading through the villages, that the general took his first step towards the impossible. A silent, invisible step, camouflaged among rumors, false trails, and signs that no one would notice at first glance. It was the beginning of a strategy that would change everything. A strategy that would transform weakness into strength, disadvantage into advantage, and fear into a weapon. Before we move on to the moment when this deception scheme begins to take shape, I want you to leave a comment below showing that you're following this story to the end. Comment deception, or I would have fallen for that plan, because this strengthens our army of curious viewers and helps this video reach more people who love absurd true stories, unbelievable facts, and impossible strategies like this one. Let's continue together, because now the real war begins. After all, how could one raise a sword against a sea of spears? How could one keep hope alive when every report reaching the borders spoke of crumbling cities, destroyed roads, and battles lost before they even began? The war seemed lost long before the first clash between armies. Men returned from the outposts with vacant stares, stating that the enemy was like an iron storm that consumed everything, inexorable, unstoppable, crushing anyone who dared to stand in its way. It was impossible to deny. The disparity between the forces was so absurd that even the oldest, accustomed to stories of miracles and impossible feats, murmured that this might be the end of their people. Mothers prayed to the gods that their sons would not be called up. Merchants abandoned their caravans. The soldiers, though trained, felt the weight of reality in every breath. Fear spread like a disease. Faced with this avalanche of imminent destruction, the general walked silently among his men. He saw the same question in every face. Do we really have a chance? It was a fair question because rationally the answer seemed to be no. The enemy possessed everything. They lacked numbers, supplies, weapons, allies, a consolidated strategy, high morale. They were 3 times larger, 3 times better equipped, and 3 times more confident. The difference was so monstrous that it was almost cruel. Many believed that resisting was merely prolonging the inevitable. Others said that faced with such a powerful army, even courage became useless. And yet there was something in the general's gaze that prevented his soldiers from completely succumbing to despair. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a childish illusion of heroism. It was something deeper, the feeling that he saw a path that no one else could see. While the people tried to maintain normalcy and the soldiers trained mechanically, the general observed the horizon as if every detail had value. He walked through the empty fields, studied torn maps, analyzed the enemy's route, listened to rumors, calculated distances, assessed the fatigue of the opposing troops, the exaggerated pride of his generals, the arrogance with which they advanced. And it was there that the first spark of improbable hope arose, not a hope of strength, but of intelligence. Because for him, the real battle would not begin when swords clashed, but the moment the enemy believed they were winning. The real despair stemmed precisely from the certainty everyone shared. The enemy could not be defeated. They had triple numerical superiority, but that wasn't the most frightening part. The worst part was their confidence. The absolute conviction that they would win made them advance too quickly, talk too much, and flaunt their supposed invincibility too much. And the general knew that this was the weakness. While everyone saw an unbreakable wall, he saw cracks. While everyone spoke of inevitable defeat, he spoke of strategy. While everyone bowed to fear, he bowed to analysis. It was this difference that would begin to turn the tide. Yes, the kingdom was on the brink of the abyss. Yes, everything indicated there was no way out. But it is precisely when the world believes defeat is certain that the men capable of changing history reveal themselves. And the general was beginning to realize that his people didn't need strength to win. They needed the enemy to believe in a strength that didn't exist. They needed to transform their own weakness into a disguise. They needed to make the adversary lose themselves in their own arrogance. They needed to use the mind as a weapon, doubt as a shield, deception as a strategy. And before we move on to the moment when the general finally reveals the first move of this impossible strategy, leave a comment with the phrase ... I see the gaps or the impossible starts now. This helps the video reach more curious warriors and keeps this true story so absurd it seems like fictional, live and pulsating. Let's move on because the plan is about to begin. It was then that the general spoke, with a serenity that makes more noise than a marching army. If I cannot defeat them by force, I will defeat their certainties. And in that silent, almost sacred instant, the turning point was born that would change the course of the entire war. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a fiery speech, it wasn't a desperate order. It was a simple phrase, but loaded with something his men hadn't seen for weeks. Direction. Suddenly, the panic that hung over the camp began to transform into curiosity. Everyone was asking themselves the same question: how to defeat such a large enemy using only their minds. And that's when the general began the plan that would later be studied as one of the most absurd, ingenious, and unbelievable strategies in the real history of ancient wars. The first move was silent. He ordered small fractions of his army to light bonfires on distant hills, creating the illusion of a gigantic contingent positioning itself overnight. A few soldiers were enough to create a sea of lights, and on the other side of the border, enemy scouts returned terrified, claiming that the general's army seemed to have tripled in size. Next, he scattered false trails across the terrain-wide footprints, wheel tracks, food remains, and traces that hinted at the presence of battalions that simply did not exist. Every detail was placed with almost artisanal precision. The intention was not just to deceive the eyes, it was to deceive the mind. The manipulation of signals was even bolder. False messengers were sent along routes where the enemy would certainly intercept them. They carried carefully fabricated documents suggesting attacks that would never happen, reinforcements that would never arrive, imaginary alliances, and invented movements. Many would say it was too risky to let the enemy capture such important information, but that was precisely the point. The more impossible the information seemed, the more truthful it became in the eyes of those who already believed they were dealing with an unpredictable commander. Gradually, the enemy began to believe not only in a lie, but in an entire parallel reality created by the general. They saw campfires where there were only small groups. They discussed non-existent units. They moved enormous troops to respond to threats that were merely shadows. They reinforced borders unnecessarily, sent panicked messengers, reorganized battalions, increased watchtowers, burned supplies in their haste to change strategies. It was like watching a giant stumble over its own feet while trying to crush an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once, but which in reality barely had enough men to fill a single battle line. The more the general manipulated this dance of appearances, the more the enemy buried themselves in their own confusion. They believed the lies so much that they began to see signs where there were none. Any movement of birds became an alert. Any echo in the mountains seemed like the advance of a hidden troop. Any track on the ground became a reason for fear. The general knew exactly what he was doing. When an army begins to fight against ghosts, it has already lost half the battle. What's most impressive is that the general didn't need to exaggerate. The enemy's own insecurities did much of the work. A gigantic army accustomed to winning by force doesn't know how to deal with what it can't measure. They were used to counting soldiers, weighing weapons, assessing walls. But how does one prepare an attack against the unknown? How does one confront an invisible threat that always seems one step ahead? The more they tried to understand, the more they sank into fear. The general had achieved the impossible, transforming their weakness into a weapon and turning the enemy's strength into their greatest blind spot. And before we move on to the moment when this grand theater of illusions reaches its climax, leave a comment below with the phrase, "I saw the fake bonfires," or if you want something more direct, write ... double quotes, "The enemy fell for the lie." This greatly helps the video reach more fans of true stories, impossible strategies, and wars that seem like fiction. Let's move on ... because the plan is about to get even bolder. The night became an accomplice, as if the sky itself had decided to fight alongside the general. It was as if the shadows came to life and moved according to his will. Fires that did not exist shone in the valleys like lost constellations, and invisible marshes echoed through the mountains, creating the illusion that countless troops were descending from the hills ready to attack. The enemy, accustomed to winning by force and the appearance of superiority, found itself paralyzed by something it did not know how to face: absolute uncertainty. The darkness that was once merely the natural mantle of the mountains now seemed to hide every fantasy created by the general, every false trail, every invented movement. And the most impressive thing is that the enemy did not realize that it was fighting against ghosts. For them, everything seemed too real to be questioned. Tension was at its peak. With each new campfire lit by just 2 or 3 soldiers, it seemed as if hundreds were arriving to reinforce the lines. With each stone rolling downhill, they believed an entire troop was approaching. The enemy sentries began to lose mental control, reporting sounds, figures, and movements that never existed. A simple snap of a branch became a sign of ambush. The howl of an animal transformed into an alert of imminent attack. And the general knew that when the mind enters this state, any lie, however improbable, becomes absolute truth. Fatal errors began to cascade. One enemy detachment, convinced it was about to be surrounded, retreated in panic, leaving behind supplies and equipment. Another, gripped by the fear of being attacked at night, lit too many torches, revealing its position to anyone who wanted to see them. Still others, trying to avoid a non-existent ambush, strayed from the main path, scattering and separating from the army's central force. This fragmentation was exactly what the general had hoped for. The larger the enemy, the greater the chaos when it loses its own cohesion. Fear distorted decisions, turned arrogant generals into insecure men, and slowly destroyed their confidence in their own strength. Total misinformation spread like wildfire. Rumors raced through the enemy ranks with the speed of an arrow. Some said the general's army had secret reinforcements. Others claimed to have seen horsemen emerging from the mountains. There were even those who swore they had heard war drums coming from the east, even though no one was there. The enemy was being defeated by its own imagination, and the general merely observed, adjusting details here and there, amplifying the confusion when necessary, fueling the terror with tiny clues that grew monstrously in the minds of his adversaries. A growing sense of chaos completely dominated the following nights. The enemy could no longer sleep without imagining a sudden attack. Their allies distrusted one another. Their leadership argued amongst themselves about which threat was real and which was merely a product of fear. And while all this was happening, the general continued to move his pieces with surgical precision. He ordered tiny groups to march in circles for hours to simulate large-scale movements. He had some soldiers imitate the sounds of heavy weaponry, even though they possessed none. He ordered used arrows, duplicate footprints, remnants of false camps, and signs that seemed to indicate simultaneous attacks to be scattered around. The war was being fought in ears and minds, not on the battlefields. The enemy began to see patterns where there were none, began to believe in numbers that were never real, began to react to invisible traps. And that is the beauty and the cruelty of psychological warfare. When the adversary begins to fight against his own imagination, he is already defeated and doesn't know it. With each passing night, morale plummeted. With each morning, the soldiers seemed more tired. And with each new false report that reached the enemy generals, the brilliant strategy of the deceitful commander became even more consolidated. The night, which was once just darkness, was now his territory, territory where he reigned supreme, while his adversaries lost themselves in labyrinths created by their own minds. And before we move on to the next point, where this escalation of illusions reaches an unimaginable level, and where the enemy makes the mistake that would seal their fate, I ask that you leave one of the phrases in the comments that help keep our army of curious minds strong and steadfast. The night deceived the enemy, or if you're truly immersed in this true story that seems like fiction, right? I would have believed in the shadows. This strengthens our video, increases its reach, and keeps this saga alive. Let's keep going because chaos is about to turn into absolute despair, and war will break out again. Chaos had already completely engulfed the enemy when the general decided the time had come for the final blow, not an attack. Not a bloody assault, but the last piece of the illusion that would cause that gigantic army to crumble from within. For days they had fought against shadows, echoes, false fires, invented clues, and fears that grew with each passing night. Their own minds were exhausted, and their leaders frantically debated to understand what was happening. The enemy believed they were surrounded by thousands. Every decision they made reinforced this lie. And it was precisely in this fragile state that the general decided to play his last card, the one that would transform an entire war into a silent defeat. He ordered that, the following night, small units should light bonfires in wide circles, far apart from each other, creating the illusion of three large fronts advancing simultaneously. Meanwhile, a few men moved along the slopes, dragging chains, producing deliberate echoes, imitating the sounds of heavy cavalry. The mountains reflected these amplified noises, and the enemy, already on the verge of panic, believed they were about to be crushed by a colossal force. The feeling of encirclement was so convincing that even experienced soldiers began to abandon their posts to warn their commanders, pushing the enemy leadership even further towards rash decisions. And then came the moment that would seal everything. The general ordered his archers to fire just a few incendiary arrows into the air from different points. There were few, very few, no more than a dozen. But to those immersed in paranoia, it seemed like the beginning of a massive attack. The enemy, convinced that this was the anticipation of a full-scale offensive, collapsed. Their generals retreated in disarray, believing that if they waited another minute, they would be swallowed up by thousands of warriors hidden in the shadows. Entire troops began to move without coordination, abandoning strategic positions, leaving behind provisions, weapons, and even defensive structures. The general observed everything from afar, without moving his main troops. It was like watching a castle crack without anyone having struck the first blow. When dawn broke over the valley, the sight was unbelievable, even to his own men. The enemy, 3 times larger, better armed, better trained, and more confident at the start of the campaign, was in complete retreat, fleeing from an army that never existed. The handful of soldiers who actually accompanied the general couldn't believe what they were seeing. They are living witnesses that strategy, intellect, and cunning can be more devastating than any blade. The moment of victory was silent, almost poetic. There were no battle cries. There was no clash of weapons. The field was not stained with blood. The general advanced only to gather what fear had left behind. He knew that at that instant, with the enemy in flight, any organized resistance would be impossible. His tiny army seemed gigantic, not because of its size, but because of the psychological impact it had caused. His soldiers watched him with reverence without words. They understood that they had won a war they never fought, a battle decided even before it began. It was only when they captured documents abandoned by the enemy that the deception became even clearer. The opposing generals reported the presence of troops that never existed, the movement of battalions that never left the drawing board, the approach of knights who were merely echoes shaped by the night. In their desperate notes, they confessed that they were surrounded when, in truth, their own choices had surrounded them with illusions. The truth was so absurd that none of them could publicly admit that they had been defeated by the shadow of an imaginary army. The historical impact of this feat would resonate for generations. Many tried to copy the strategy, but few possessed the courage, emotional control, and intellectual precision of the general. That victory became a study for commanders, a lesson for kings, a warning to arrogant empires. The war had been won not by arm but by mind, not by sword but by doubt, not by force but by cunning. It was definitive proof that sometimes the greatest weapon a man can carry is the ability to make his enemy believe in what does not exist. And before we move on to the next part, we'll explore what happened after this impossible victory and how this strategy echoed throughout history. Leave your comment below. Right cunning prevailed, or I would have ran AWAY, TOO, or even an army that didn't exist. These words help this video reach more lovers of true stories, impossible strategies, and unbelievable wars that seem like pure fiction. Let's move on, because the legend isn't over yet.